Cool. All right, I'm going to get rolling here. So this is going to be a lot of stuff that I probably going to run out of time on, but I'll do my best to leave some time for questions. So this is a paper that I wrote last semester for an independent study with Dr. Garcelon, and it's like only borderline economics. To be honest, it's like kind of not really economics so much, but hey, we're like an interdisciplinary PhD program, so we're supposed to do stuff like that. So like, sure, why not? So the point here is to talk about groups and how groups work together as units. So what am I doing here? The basic question is, why do some groups integrate? And by integrate, I mean act in a coherent fashion as a group, following their group interests, and others don't. So the question is why? And so this has been an interdisciplinary project that ended up bridging 3 bodies of work. So one of them is called Multilevel Selection Theory, or MLS, which is a big school of thought in evolutionary biology. The second one is called Social Interdependence Theory, or SIT, which is big in social psychology. And then the third one is the theory of anticipatory systems, which is got by a guy named Robert Rosen. And you could call that field relational biology or mathematical biology. And why am I doing this? What's the overall point? Well, I think it's got strong implications for like political analysis, but then also in a more economic sense, these bodies of work all reach conclusions about competition and cooperation that are quite different than mainstream economics, right? So it provides like a different starting place to ask those kinds of questions. And I'm going to take these 3 bodies of work in the order that they're listed right there, although in the paper, the second one is actually first. But I'm going to list them in the order that I discovered them. Well, actually, that's not true. But I discovered MLS first, so I'm going to start with that first. So here we go. So what is multi-level selection theory? So to understand what MLS is, you actually need some of the history. So I'm going to talk about that for a minute. And contemporaneously with the neoliberal turn in economics, evolutionary biology also took an individualist turn toward what you can kind of loosely call selfish gene theory, which I'm hoping most of you guys are familiar with. The leading proponent is Richard Dawkins in the book, The Selfish Gene, right? But it was pretty broad in the field. And what is all that? Well, natural selection, Darwinian evolution, you think about it for a second and you'd think it ought to produce selfishness, right? Because you've got organisms basically competing against each other to survive and reproduce. So it ought to produce selfishness, but we see a ton of cooperation, obviously in human society, but even in nature as well. And so the question from that lens is like, why and how does this come into existence? And Darwin himself actually proposed a solution, which is group level selection. Okay, so selfish individuals might beat out altruistic individuals within a group, right? Because if you're being altruistic, you're not promoting your own survival and reproduction. So within a group, altruistic individuals ought to lose out to selfish individuals. But if we have groups that are competing against each other, then groups of altruistic individuals who are contributing to the common good of that group ought to beat out groups of selfish individuals who are not contributing to the common good of that group. So this is group level selection, and it comes from Darwin, right? But the selfish gene movement, kind of starting in the 1960s and 70s, basically denied the existence of group selection. And it was mostly a mathematical argument using math models to argue that group selection is theoretically implausible. Not that it's impossible, but that the conditions required for it just don't happen most of the time. And so instead, in that view, to explain altruistic behavior, you need other mechanisms or other theories, right? So I have just a short list of a couple. One is the theory of kin selection, reciprocal altruism. Basically, I do stuff for you because you're doing stuff for me, and that's the only reason. Or repeated game theory, like repeated prisoner's dilemma type explanations. So this is how the selfish gene folks tried to explain the existence of altruism. But then there was a counter backlash to that. So this is less well known in pop culture, but in the 90s and 2000s, there was a counter backlash. And so new mathematical models and also empirical evidence, group selection came back into style, right? And in fact, the new view, interestingly enough, argues that all of the non-group selection mechanisms that altruism was supposed to arise by, that the selfish gene people were promoting, if you define group in the right way, all of those explanations actually have group selection in them anyway. So that's kind of interesting. So group selection's back, although not as naive as it was prior to the 60s, right? Before the 60s, people would use group selection kind of all the time, even when it was implausible. They were talking about things like animals doing good things for the good of their species or for the good of the entire ecosystem, which are like not evolutionarily plausible. So the new group selection is like more disciplined than that and only argues, well, group selection can happen, but it needs to be demonstrated. We can't just assume it's always going on in every case. And in particular, cultural evolution in human societies might be more conducive to the conditions that group selection needs than genetic evolution. So group selection might be a really potent force for explaining cooperation in humans. So the argument goes. So we've now got multiple levels of selection here. We've got between group selection, so groups, group competition, group selection, and then within group selection, or the more individual level selection within a group. So these are assumed to be happening at the same time, right? And then the relative strength of the pressures, the selection pressures, determines what the outcome is. Is there a lot of within group selection and not very much between group selection? Then we'd expect more selfish behaviors to evolve. If there's a lot of between group selection, but not a lot of within group selection, then we expect more altruistic behaviors to evolve. And if there's some of both, then the outcome is somewhere in the middle. And then MLS also comes with a major new addition that is called Major Evolutionary Transition Theory. And this argues that through very strong group selection pressures, groups can become so groupish, so group-like, that they actually become a single entity in their own right. Okay, so it's like we start off with a group of organisms that, you know, don't have maybe so much to do with each other, and then they become more group-like, they cooperate more and more, and then they're cooperating so much that from the outside, we might look at that and go, wow, that's just one thing. That's a single entity in its own right. That's how coordinated it all is. This produces like a new level of selection. And this has happened multiple times, but in my opinion, the most stunning example, and I think the best for getting the point across, is multicellular life, right? So MLS would say that the way multicellular life came into existence is that there were single-celled organisms, and group selection kind of forced them to cooperate more and more. But then group selection pressures became so high that these loose social groups became so coordinated and so tight-knit that they merged into a single entity in their own right that we would call a multicellular organism. Okay, so what does that mean? It means you, a multicellular organism, you people watching out there, one way to think of you is not just one thing, but actually a tightly bound group of cells, right? A social group that is so tightly bound that it appears to you to be one thing, right? So MLS revives the society as an organism metaphor by uniting it with its mirror, organism as society. This is saying we can think of an organism, like a you, as a society of things, and therefore we can also think of society as a whole as an organism of things. So here's some takeaways from MLS. Selection is happening at many hierarchical levels simultaneously. So it's got this nested hierarchical aspect to it. And I've only mentioned really 2 levels here, or 3 levels maybe, which are like groups of people, individual organisms, and then like cells within them. But there's like a few more levels in that rung that I'm just not mentioning here. Strong selection at higher levels makes a group at that level more like a single entity. Right? Group selection makes the group more like a single entity. Selection pressure at lower levels, so competition at lower levels, tends to disrupt adaptations that serve the higher level entity. Okay, so group selection makes the group more like a single entity, but within group selection, between individuals in the group, tends to disrupt the groupishness, the coordination of the whole group. So one example of this might be cancer cells, right? So cancer is the result, or the way MLS understands cancer, is the result of runaway natural selection within your body, right? Cancer is when some cells in your body start figuring out a way to just reproduce like crazy, right? And so they're out evolving the other cells in your body and just getting bigger and bigger on their own, right? Avoiding cancer requires your body to carefully control and suppress this natural selection to prevent this runaway growth within your body, right? But it's not always true that internal conflict needs to be suppressed. Sometimes group selection can produce internally competitive processes that actually benefit the group. And then generally this is because evolutionary processes can be innovative, right? Because evolution is like a change algorithm, right? Or I'm going to talk about it later as like a learning mechanism. And so through an evolutionary process, the system can discover, new ways of being, new ways of solving problems. And so this is like a thing that's happened in evolutionary history where your body itself maybe puts evolution to work within your body to produce new adaptations. So this happens in your immune system. It happens in your brain. There are some internally competitive processes in your body when your body needs like a process to adapt and evolve kind of in real time, right? So the term for this, an evolutionary process that was itself produced by evolution, is called a Darwin machine, which I think is fun. So kind of takeaway, internal competition needs to be carefully managed or else it will disrupt the group coherence of the higher group. That's what MLS says. So what is my problem with MLS? Well, these seem like pretty promising conclusions on which to base a heterodox social theory, and it actually dovetails pretty nicely with like some post-Keynesian views on market governance or institutionalist views on going concerns, complexity theory and emergence and that kind of stuff. And you see like the MLS people trying to apply these like parables to human social affairs, right? But it's not really clear to me that it's justified to shift those ideas from evolution, especially biological evolution, onto human organizations and markets. There are theories of cultural evolution, and there are some Darwinian processes, happening in the economy, and there's like evolutionary economics and stuff. But a lot of social change doesn't require like population level change, like we think about Darwinian evolution is about, right? Darwinian evolution is like the less fit entities like don't survive, and so the population becomes more fit, and that does happen. But it also happens that human social units just change, right? Individuals learn things. A business changes their strategy, or a group of some organization like tries a new thing or whatever. And to me, stretching evolution onto that is like, it's a stretch. I don't think I'm going to talk about this, but there's just one example here about Ostrom's core design principles, and the MLS folks are like trying to use Ostrom's work as an example of group selection. So I'm not going to get into that one. But if you know about Ostrom and the core design principles, there's some interesting stuff there. Okay, part 2 here, the second body of work that I'm trying to bring together is called Social Interdependence Theory, or SIT. And this is big in social psychology. It's huge, actually. There's like thousands of papers. And it's about competition and cooperation between people, often within small groups. So now we were talking about like, physical life before. Now we're talking about humans and social groups. Okay, so change gears in your head if you need to. And SIT kind of revolves around these concepts of positive and negative interdependence. So here's what those are. Positive interdependence is when my goal can only be achieved if your goal is also achieved, and vice versa, right? So positive interdependence, the two of us can only do what we're trying to do if both of us succeed, right? Negative interdependence is when my goal can only be achieved if your goal is not achieved, and vice versa. So I only succeed if you fail, and vice versa. That's negative interdependence. And kind of as you might think, the theory says that positive interdependence encourages cooperative psychological processes and behaviors, while negative interdependence encourages competitive, or I would even use the word sabotaging behavior, or psychology and behavior. So another important concept in SIT is, this is a really fun word to say, like try saying it 5 times fast, entitativity. Entitativity is the degree to which a group of people is perceived to be a single entity, right? Entityness, entitativity. And this is about perceptions, and it could be from the group members, like within the group, how much do you think of yourselves as like a single unit? Or from outside the group, how much do you think of that other group as a single unit, right? And there's a lot of ramifications here that I'm not really going to get into right now about that. I will note that entitativity is generally about perceptions, although some authors use the term group coherence or group integration to talk about the degree to which a group actually is acting like a single entity, right? So entitativity tends to be more like, do we think of this group as a single entity? Group coherence or group integration, are they actually acting like a single entity? So here are some takeaways from SIT. Positive interdependence promotes entitativity or group integration. If we're in these situations where our goals require us to work together, then that tends to promote the degree to which we think of ourselves and others think of us, and we act like a single unit. Yeah. Negative interdependence within a group tends to reduce entitativity or integration. So if our goals are competitive, that's going to tend to reduce the amount of which people think of us, or we act as if we're a single unit with a singular purpose, right? But there are some exceptions to this. And so SIT would say that competition within the group can promote the group interests if, number one, winning is not especially important to the competitors, right? If winning is too important, then people start sabotaging each other and stuff, right? Every competitor has a genuine chance of winning. If you don't think you actually have a chance of winning, why are you even going to play, right? This just promotes hopelessness. And the rules of the competition are specified unambiguously. If the rules aren't clear, then people start arguing over the rules, and you're wasting time and effort on that. So there's some interesting more stuff here, but I think that's where I'm going to leave that. So basically, in SIT, competition must be managed, or else it won't contribute to the general good. Okay, so I'm like, where have we heard that before? Another interesting bit, negative interdependence, so competition, can increase entitativity in a spiraling fashion. So that is, when one group becomes more coherent or more entity-like, then just by having done that, by acting with more unity of purpose, it becomes a greater threat to its competitors, right? So how are the competitors, what should they do to respond? Well, maybe they should become more entity-like as well, more coherent as well. And once they've done that, then, well, how should the first group respond? Well, then now that's a bigger threat to them. So they need to become more entity-like, right? So you can get these spiraling arms races of becoming more and more of a coherent group in response to your competitors also doing that. Okay, so that was SIT. And then here's the third body of ideas from Robert Rosen, Theory of Anticipatory Systems. So the previous two bodies of work, you'll notice they reach kind of analogous conclusions. They're not talking about the same systems. One of them is about, we're talking about biological evolution, we're talking about cells and stuff, or, just organisms or whatever. And then SIT is talking about humans and human social groups, but the conclusions seem like eerily similar. So that says to me that there's some common logics in here. There's some common processes or common logics, and we ought to have some kind of language that can encompass both of them, right? Not that you would be able to pull every detail out of it, but just that what is some of the core logic that's happening here in both of these domains, and how can we express it kind of more purely? And I think that Rosen's anticipatory systems framework provides that. So kind of what I do in the paper is I use the language that Rosen provides to reformulate this stuff in a kind of general way that allows for both of these things to fall out of it. I'm not exactly going to do that here because it gets just like a little bit mathy, or a little symbolic, but I'm going to give you some of the highlights. Yeah. So for Rosen, his theory is abstract, okay, and the unit of analysis in the theory is a system, and those systems interact with their environment through inputs and outputs. And the key thing to the anticipatory part is they have an internal model that can simulate the world inside the system, and it simulates the world in faster than real time, meaning it can predict the future, basically, in order to decide how to set its outputs to achieve some goal. So you're a system, you've got a goal, you need to know what the world is going to do in order to decide what actions you should take. So you simulate the world using a model in order to figure out what to do to achieve your goal. Okay. That sounds like very goal-oriented, like maybe you're thinking people and consciousness and stuff, but really it doesn't have to be talking about consciousness or animals or anything like that, right? And so one example here might be like a Nest thermostat. How does a Nest thermostat work? It's got a model that says, it's got a goal, which is like keep the house at a comfortable temperature. And it's got a model that says, here's what's going to be happening during the day. And so here's the actions it should take to achieve that goal, right? The Nest thermostat, those aren't conscious, but this is all functional. They act as if they have a goal, and they act as if they have a model that's telling them how to achieve that goal. And then Rosen would say that goals are imposed on non-conscious systems by evolution or design. So humans design systems that operate as if they have a goal, or there's some kind of selection process that's like taking from all the universe of possible systems, the ones that appear to have a goal, and then those are the ones we see as the outcome of an evolutionary process. And then because models are always simplifications of the world, right? Models are always simplifications. And so they're missing stuff about the world. The world is a big complex system, and the model only captures some small part of it. And what that means is that the model is always going to eventually fail. The parts of the world that you're not modeling eventually change the parts that you are modeling, and your model stops being relevant and applicable and stops being a good guide to decision making. And so then your model fails. So in this view, if you want a model to work for a long time, it has to be periodically recalibrated. Basically, it has to learn what is the world like now. Okay, but then for Rosen, selection pressures, natural selection and evolution, or artificial selection, they are a form of learning, which produces models of the selection pressure itself. Okay, so you're an animal and, I don't know, you exist in this world that requires you to like act a certain way or else you don't survive and reproduce. So what's going to happen? Evolution and natural selection are going to select for the animals that act as if they know what they need to do in order to survive and reproduce. So ones that can model the selection pressure itself and then act according to it, even though they actually get selected in the future. And then Rosen's formalism already has some degree of multi-levelness when he argues that systems can be made of subsystems, which can be made of more subsystems, and et cetera. And then selection pressures at different levels can come into conflict. So this is all in Rosen. And then there's no reason in Rosen that the system can't be a gene. So this already includes genetic evolution. And then the system could also be a human. So we could be talking about human goals as well, right? It's just kind of a general formalism. Okay. So what do I think I'm adding to this conversation? Here's what I think I'm doing, at least. Number one, I'm trying to use this language to codify a definition of incentives using Rosen's formalism. It occurred to me that the concept of incentives is actually really helpful here. I know heterodox people hate that, but I think it's actually pretty useful. And I started looking for like, what is the actual dictionary definition of the word incentives? And what you'll find is most economics books do not have one. You can like look in economics textbooks. I looked in a handful of economics dictionaries and glossaries and stuff. I think I found like one out of like 10 or 15 books that I looked in. So this is actually just not talked about very often, I guess, in economics. And then if you look in dictionaries, the definitions, I looked in a few dictionaries, just normal dictionaries, and those definitions are also like wildly unspecific. So using this language, I think you can come up with a more precise definition for incentive. And here's what I got. And this is like a little bit more symbolic and mathematical in the paper, but in general terms, a system has an incentive to perform some action if, given its environment, that action will achieve the system's goal. Okay, so incentive here requires some reference to a goal, which again can be functional. You don't have to know what it is, and a reference to an environment, right? And to a system that can take action. In Rosen's terms then, learning is the process by which the systems learn to model their incentives so that they can then act in accordance with your incentives, right? You learn what your incentives are so that then you can take actions that align with them. And this applies to groups as well. So, you know, this whole logic in all three of these theories is kind of like level independent, right? Or the term they use in MLS is like you can frame shift between different levels. So if it's okay to talk about an individual having an incentive, then it's perfectly okay to talk about a group having an incentive as well, because individuals are groups, right? And so you can talk about group incentives here as well. The group as a whole, as a unit, what kind of incentives does it face? So another one, apply the concept of group integration using Rosen and this incentive definition. So here it is. A more integrated group of systems is one that can learn to act in accordance with its group incentives. Okay, so in less integrated groups, you've got some internal conflict that prevents the group from acting in accordance with its group incentives, right? So imagine like one group of people that are like clearly doing the rational thing, acting as a unit, singularity of purpose and voice, right? Though that is a highly integrated group that is acting in accordance with its group incentives. On the other hand, you can imagine like a group that just can't stop bickering and there's like obvious things that they should be doing for the good of the group, but they can't do it because there's just too much internal conflict, right? That's a less integrated group, and that conflict prevents the group from acting in accordance with its group incentives. Next, apply positive and negative interdependence to Rosen's systems. Those terms come from SIT, although, you know, like minor humble brag, the reason I even discovered SIT was because I thought of those terms and those exact definitions. And then like a day later, I was like, maybe I should see if anybody else has come up with that thing before. And then there it is, there's like a whole body of work all about it, right? So anyway, I know it is cool. So positive interdependence creates incentives for more group integration. Okay, positive interdependence creates incentives for more group integration. If your fates are intertwined, your goals are intertwined, then you ought to be more cooperative. You ought to act more like a single unit. Whereas negative interdependence will tend to disrupt group integration unless it's carefully managed. And then for genes, how do you put this in the level of genes? Well, when we talk about individual level selection or within group selection, for genes, what we're talking about is a kind of negative interdependence. Whereas when we talk about between group selection or just group selection, that is a kind of positive interdependence, right? So that's how this terminology kind of subsumes the genetic terminology. And then this one, defining instruments of integration. So by this term, I mean, these are structures or processes that can increase the level of cooperation beyond what the degree of positive interdependence would otherwise call for. So we're in some situation where we need to act really cooperative, okay? So the example I keep going to on this is like, you've got a group of soldiers and they're trying to like storm an enemy compound, okay? But they're doing it in the dead of night. And so they've got to be very quiet because they don't want to wake up the enemies. So if any of them make a single, wrong move, they make a little sound, like snap a twig or something, the barracks full of the enemy soldiers all wake up and then they're all dead, right? Okay, so this group, there's a lot of positive interdependence. They really need to act like a single unit or else all of them are going to fail at their goal. So in those situations, you expect there to be a lot of cooperation, and we do observe that a lot of the time. But in some cases, that degree of positive interdependence is not there, but groups still cooperate. And a lot of the time they do that through this kind of thing, instruments of integration, which means like take something that would be cooperative or altruistic and make it selfish, or make it something that you do for selfish reasons. So here's an example. If people just donated a ton of money to the overall public good, we would think of that as very cooperative, very charitable, very altruistic, right? But now that I tell you the reason they're doing that is because if they don't, they're going to go to jail for not paying their taxes. And the MMT folks put that aside for a second. The people are making its donations to the public good, not because of the goodness of their heart, but because of the tax enforcement, right? Tax enforcement is an instrument of integration. It's a structure or process that increases the degree of cooperation beyond what people would just be doing on their own based on how much positive interdependence there is, right? So it's in MLS, this kind of thing is sometimes called a second order public good, right? People aren't contributing to the public just as a public good. They're not just making all these big donations, but some people are kind of altruistically enforcing taxes, which then amplifies the amount of cooperation that people are doing, right? And there's all kinds of examples you can think about. And then if you talked about Ostrom and the core design principles, most of those would fall under this term of instruments of integration. But then since learning systems learn, we should expect both innovation in new instruments of integration and also innovations in evading existing instruments of integration. So these things break down over time as people learn to evade them. And this is like an institutional idea about institutional drift towards maladaptiveness, right? You build an institution for some purpose to solve some problem, but then it stops working either because it's sclerotic on its own or because people start finding ways that, loopholes in the rules and stuff. And in particular, parties who are already winning conflicts don't necessarily have any incentive to cease the conflict, right? And so this is the problem of entrenched interests, right? Instruments of integration are sort of like a ceasefire, but some people don't want a ceasefire. Okay, and then the other thing I'm trying to do here is just kind of generally push the logic of all this stuff a little farther, right? So another mode of conflict between groups getting into conflict, how do they fight each other, is to disrupt group coherence. Okay, so animals, this is hard to think of what this might mean, but humans do this all the time. When we talk about divide and conquer, that's exactly what that is. You're trying to fight a group by disrupting their group coherence, make them less able to act as a unit by some divide and conquer strategy. Or we might talk about checks and balances, right? Pit groups into conflict structurally to disrupt the coherence of the overall unit. So the idea is oh, the government might be too powerful. They're going to abuse their citizens. So what do? Create conflict, structural conflict within the government so they can't mobilize as a unit to abuse the citizen. That's the logic of checks and balances. And this may itself be an instrument of integration, right? The idea being for the greater good, maybe the good of the nation or something, we're going to reduce conflict within the subgroups of that greater good by disrupting the group coherence of those groups so that we tamp down on that conflict by just make them less able to fight it because they're less able to act as a unit. So pushing the logic more, what else we got? I'm trying to a little more clearly delineate between two different kinds of learning processes, right? Usually when we talk about learning, we're thinking of individual level learning. I learned something. We might also think about organizational level learning as well. But then what Rosen does is he's saying we should think of evolution as a learning mechanism too. It's a population level learning mechanism. If individuals aren't going to learn something that they ought to be learning based on the environment, then lo and behold, they're going to get replaced with people who will. Right. And, so this is the same for humans. It's the same for animals. thinking of evolution as a population level learning mechanism. The population learns even if nobody in the population learns. And that kind of logic actually has been used in economics before. This was like a paper by Alchian from 1950 that I cite in here. And then a little bit more economics-y, talking about entitativity and the tendency towards full employment, right? So mainstream economics, we all know, assumes scarcity, but scarcity, if you think in the terms I'm giving you here, scarcity, like global scarcity or full employment, don't really make a lot of sense, except in two cases. Number one, the system, like no groups in the system have any coherence whatsoever. So you think maybe the people are maybe coherent, but we've got this like war of all against all. And so nobody is on a side with anybody else. In which case maybe, okay, so what are people going to do? They're just going to take all of their local resources. So I'm taking everything I can get my hands on, and you're taking everything you can get your hands on, right? And so maybe we get scarcity that way because everybody's just grabbing at everything and everything is getting claimed by somebody who can. The other situation where we might expect full employment or like a persistent scarcity is if the system is perfectly coherent, right? Like if the whole world, let's say, is acting like one single entity, and if they're going to do that, well, you know, they've got the population maybe has goals like improve the quality of life, grow and reproduce, yada, 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 and they would use every resource at their disposal to make that happen if they're acting as one single unit, right? But neither of those are true in real life. In the real world, we've got social groups with varying degrees of coherence. And so you would not expect full employment or global scarcity if some subgroup can gain an advantage over another group by preventing it, right? So this is Koleski, and this is capitalists don't want full employment. Excuse me. Koleski, Political Aspects of Full Employment, 1943 paper, arguing that full employment is bad for the capitalist class. And so if we had it for a long time, they would start mobilizing to make it stop, right? To impose unemployment back on the economy. Yeah. So this is that kind of logic. Another point, if all of these theories kind of imply that competition must be carefully managed, and it really seems to fall right out of the framework of those theories, why doesn't mainstream economics say that? You know, you can ask political reasons why it doesn't say that, but like methodologically, why doesn't it say that? Well, the assumptions of perfect competition, I argue they simply assume that careful management right into the background, right? It's there and they just don't talk about it. And part of this, I think, has something to do with the nature of mathematics, where if you're going to make a mathematical model, when you start listing equations, you're listing every single way that the system is allowed to interact, right? And so if you don't list it, it's not there, it's not in the model. Whereas in real life, learning systems especially are going to find new ways to constantly interact with each other. So listing all the ways individually is not really a viable modeling strategy for capturing a learning system. Instead, you kind of have to allow for like an infinity of possible ways and, you know, instead of adding them one at a time, you have to like subtract them, right? Which ones are impossible, and then allow everything that's not impossible. So long story short there, the assumptions of perfect competition assume careful management into the background. So like in perfect competition, firms are only allowed to compete on price, right? Why aren't they allowed to compete on all the other stuff that firms actually compete on? Well, somebody must be managing that to prevent it from happening, right? Or how about information is symmetric? How come information is symmetric? Well, somebody must be providing information to people or else we don't have symmetric information, right? So that's kind of the logic there. So basically from this point of view, mainstream economics goes backwards, right? It starts by assuming the management is there without telling you, and then looking at some cases where it's not. Whereas a more straightforward methodology from this lens is start by assuming there is no management. And so competition is going to be generally destructive, and then talk about what kind of management we need to funnel it in a productive direction. Okay, I'm not going to talk about Ostrom. And then I think this provides kind of a generalized explanation of races to the bottom, these race to the bottom phenomenon. And this happens when negative interdependence in a system increases. And so competition intensifies and group coherence erodes. So think like the corporate income tax, like race to the bottom between different countries, right? Where like capital barriers were relaxed and then corporations started just like picking which country to put their headquarters, or at least their tax headquarters in, based on who has the lowest corporate tax rate, right? Which then countries started competing against each other to drive corporate tax rates down, this race to the bottom. Well, so what happened was there was some change that increase the amount of negative interdependence between countries. Now they're competing against each other. They act less and less like a unit. You've got this group coherence eroding. They would all be better off if they could keep corporate tax rates high and collect the revenue or whatever, but they don't have the coherence to be able to do it. But then these are learning systems, right? And so things don't stay static. And so this kind of thing then might later promote innovations in new instruments of integration, right? Which is like the corporate tax treaties or whatever that Biden was trying to do in the last year. That kind of thing is like, you can think of it as building cooperation back in these systems to increase it beyond what the conditions would allow for otherwise. And then finally, can't see it here. I'm basically arguing that this lens provides a powerful tool for examining political trends, right? So within this lens, you would ask questions like, which groups are increasing in coherence and which groups are decreasing? So we all living in this country right now, I think we all feel that like there is no national unity. It really feels like at the national level, maybe there was some group coherence in the past, but there's not now, right? There's like not nearly enough group coherence to act as a single unit in that way, or at least not as much as before, right? I mean, there's still obviously all kinds of things we're doing. But then other groups we see are becoming more and more coherent as time passes. So the two that I think are probably most obvious to everybody are political party. The political parties are becoming more and more coherent entities in their own right, and thinking of each other with more entitativity. You see like boundaries getting sharpened and them acting more like singular units. And maybe race is another one as well, where like people in different races, you might see, I think there's like some kind of a spiraling increase in entitativity along racial lines as well has been happening in the last few decades. So you'd look for things like that. Which groups are increasing in coherence or decreasing? Why? What are the conditions of positive or negative interdependence that are promoting that? Okay, and that's all I got.
Hey, Sam, question and a suggestion. Question, I think I may have lost the plot, but why were you emphasizing the point that there is not, or how are you writing off scarcity, right? If we're talking finances, yeah, it's not scarce, right? It's infinite, it can be. But real resources, there is scarcity, right? As far as labor, as far as, raw materials we extract from the environment. I mean, it is finite. It is a closed loop system of that stuff. So, but you seem to say it's not, we're not facing scarcity.
It's not that I'm saying that material resources are infinite, but I'm saying that we're not using them all. And why aren't we using them all? Right? If we were more coherent at like a global or even national level, we would be using them all.
Well, hopefully we're leaving something in the ground for future generations.
Yeah, I mean, well, that too, but I mean, like, I'm thinking of like labor, right? I'm thinking like, why do we always have 5 to 10% unemployment all the time?
Got it. And the other thing, a suggestion or maybe a question, have you poked around, just thinking about the title of this paper and what you're talking about, have you poked around blockchain tokenized incentive schemes to drive consumer and supply chain behavior?
No.
I mean, it just, it's an interesting, like, real world application, of incentive schemes to affect, behavior in economies and communities. Might be interesting to take a quick look at some of those examples and think about that relative to your topic here, right? As a case study. Anyway, good job. Interesting stuff.
Cool. Thank you.
So how would you talk about, like, given that this is coming from a lot of biological research and that like a biological organism is a, kind of more clear-cut system with defined boundaries than something like let's talk about like a political party versus organism. Like you can generally maybe more easily talk about how the organs in your body or the cells that are a part of organ systems or the genes that manufacture proteins in those cells are all kind of like part of this more integrated, defined system. Whereas a political party, you could talk about, I don't know, let's talk about like Joe Manchin or all the outside allegiances that he has to either donors or external political organizations. And these like interdependent parts of multiple systems where the systems are not really as well-defined organisms, but just kind of like institutional structures that, it's harder to talk about.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is that this boundary concept is like right in there as a spectrum with group coherence or intensivity, right? It's like a really coherent group is gonna have a boundary, like a sharp boundary, whereas a really not coherent group is not gonna have a sharp boundary. And these are things that are created, right? Because again, if you think of like cells, if you think of your body as a group of cells, okay, the boundary is actually not that sharp. For one thing, at the layer of your skin, there's like, you know, okay, for one thing, there's probably more non-human cells in your body than human cells, right? So that's like a biological fact. And then the boundary between you and the outside is actually quite porous, so things are going in and out all the time. And then if you think just in terms of cells, you know, the air is like filled with bacteria, right? So there's actually cells everywhere, so they're constantly bombarding up against you. And so the boundary, and like I said, it's porous. So even for an organism, for the sharpness of the boundary is seeing it as like an infinitely sharp boundary is a mental model that we've got. It's not actually infinitely sharp, but it is quite sharp for organisms that are very group coherent because they force it to be sharp, whereas groups that aren't coherent can't act in a way that, you know, creates a boundary like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I think about it. Pretty.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got one.
Okay.
Not actually a question. It's just a factoid that fits into this in an interesting way. You were talking about cancer as like individual competitive strategy in a group that has to be suppressed. They've also found that tumorous cancers are linked with lateral gene transfer. So there's like a feature there where the cell itself is failing to be an entity and therefore is taking on kind of like genetic strategy from another, usually a bacteria, and then becoming incapable of being part of the group, right? It takes a feature from another biome and then becomes incapable of being part of the group and becomes cancer. But it's cool.
It's like infected kind of.
It's horizontal gene transfer. So the gene actually enters the DNA strand and then inhibits the groupishness of the cell.
Cool. I know that at the Econ Club, it's like this isn't economics. What the hell you guys are about?
Do you think this is gonna, do you think framing the world in this way, like this perspective, any sort of approach like this, is there room for something like this to like help actually?
To like help politically?
Because that's the thing, right? Like we are in it. If you look at the human population as a group, right, that is not coherent, and as much as we are working against each other, many people view it as I don't win unless you lose, and not to mention the decisions that we're making as a group are literally pulling the viable world out from under us, like so politically, environmentally, whatever it is. Because that's what I was thinking a lot when you were talking, is how we're billing ourselves, right? And like that could be political or not. I mean, depending on, you know, how you look at it. But
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is pretty vague and abstract, right? So it's a little hard to like for me to pull specific policy recommendations out of it, but there's like some general things, right? So for one, we're talking about instruments of integration that increase the amount of cooperation beyond what the system maybe like looks like it would call for. So if we need more cooperation, then we need better ones of those, right? Or the ones we used to have failed and we need to come up with new ones and like innovate new ways to basically force people to cooperate or persuade them to cooperate, right? Both of those I think are valid. That's one avenue. Another is that like a lot of the problems we have seem to be all about entrenched interests. So Sam was talking about Joe Manchin and the like oil interests and stuff. So like, how do you deal with entrenched interests? And I don't know, I mean, I feel like I've ever heard a good answer to how to do that. It's like revolution is the answer or something. And this is maybe putting it in a little too broad of a terms, but some stuff in this view justifies that, because like you can imagine, okay, the reason the entrenched interests are fighting you so hard is because they are currently winning. But what if instead of trying to persuade them, you actually just escalate the conflict, right? Because if you escalate the conflict, then it changes maybe from a situation where the entrenched interests are currently winning to the one where actually we're in a completely wasteful, like nobody's winning, you know, like this war where we're just at complete loggerheads, right? And if you're in a war where you're at loggerheads and nobody's winning, then suddenly the incentives start to say like, well, maybe you should call a ceasefire. Right. So in those kinds of situations, maybe it does call for escalating conflicts to overcome this entrenched interest problem. So those are two things: innovate new instruments of integration, overcome escalate conflicts, maybe to overcome entrenched interests. I mean, there's other ways too. I don't think it all has to be a violent uprising, of course, and conflict doesn't have to be violent, obviously. But those are maybe some very high level, you know, solutions. And I also think though that to some extent, you know, I'm thinking about George Lakoff and how he's saying like the left needs to stop using the political framing and narratives and stuff that are supplied by the right, you know, like stop using right-wing language to make left-wing points, instead provide our own frames, our own narrative frames. Like there's some logic in here that falls out pretty naturally that like competition needs to be managed. You know, market forces are not all good, like some of these traditional lefty points. And so if you can get maybe more people thinking along these terms where that stuff just seems obvious, then maybe that creates some more avenues for some more political action, right? So that's like conflict at the narrative level, I guess, but I don't know. Yeah.
So following from your definition of incentive as, you know, something that promotes the goal into like the positive and the negative interdependence. It's like a very binary way of framing it. So like my question is like, how would we bring in something like uncertainty? You know, like if all of the actions I can perform have like associated probability distributions, I may not know like if I'm actually going to, you know, move forward or backward or right towards my goal. And so like, is there a way to reconcile that within this framework? Or?
Yeah, and I think it's what you do is you like make the goal. What is the goal? To include uncertainty, you make the goal include uncertainty, right? So instead of my goal being like to do something, my goal is like to increase the probability that I do something, or to increase the probability that something happens, right? Instead of my goal being like, I don't know, to give a good lecture, right? My goal is to increase the probability that I give a good lecture, right? And then, so then what actions achieve that goal? Now we can be talking about probability and uncertainty. So. Cool, anybody else got anything?
How will the language of this kind of theoretical approach map to something like class theory, or something like you could model maybe like a firm as a system, political party as a system, but like in Marxian class theory, where the conception of like the capitalist class is, you know, your status of ownership of property, means production or whatever, like in that kind of abstraction, there's no clear system there. So in the systems approach, would capitalists just be like occupying a similar role in different systems, which are different firms, or like how would it map to something?
Yeah, so I think the system concept here is really, really open. It could be, you could be talking about anything you want, and then it's nested. So you're talking about multiple things at the same time, right? So if you're talking about, you wanted to like the Marxian class analysis, you know, there's nothing wrong here with talking about capitalists as a group and workers as a group, right? And then you can say, so they've got some group level incentives. They're kind of locked in a structural conflict. And then you could say like, okay, well, how about we dive into the capitalist group? And now we're looking at within the group, and we could say, well, we've got these individual, you know, people or whatever. And then we can be talking about the conflicts that are within that group, right? And same for the workers. We could dive into that group and be talking about that. And so things can be kind of nested and overlapping and hierarchical. And yeah, I think it's a very open, loose formalism, which is why it's so vague and abstract. So I think you can still do class analysis with it. And what it does is I think it gives you a justification for talking about groups that don't feel like groups, right? Like the reason people don't want to talk about capitalists versus workers is because it's like, what about all the other stuff going on and the complexities? And, you know, like Resnick and Wolf have their whole like, there's like the class processes and the non-class, and there's like all these different, so we're talking about these people, or we might be talking about these people spend an hour of their time as like qua capitalists or whatever, right? So those kinds of issues. And this allows you to say like, forget that, we can just talk about them as a group and it's fine because no group is ever truly like, you know, infinitely coherent. All groups have, even your own body, right, is like not infinitely coherent. Like maybe young animals are very coherent. They become less coherent as they age. And then when you die, your coherence drops off a cliff, right? So even for your own body, to think of yourself as a thing is like a mental model. It's like an illusion, right? From this point of view, it's a social group. And so anytime you talk about any group, you're imposing a mental model onto them. So there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to keep in mind that some groups are more integrated than others. And so, you know, some groups are therefore going to follow their group incentives and others aren't going to.
But nothing's real.
I think it's not that nothing's real. It's that like there's, you know, this long running philosophical debate about like, can we talk about groups? Are groups real? Right? Individuals, we all agree, are real, but are groups real? And then this logic comes back and says individuals aren't even real.
Right.
And so if you can talk about individuals, then it's just as valid to talk about groups. But realness, instead of like yes, no, is a spectrum, right? How integrate or how coherent is the group? Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I was saying that for fun, but it actually really clarified what you guys not here. So.
I was just gonna, so if all individuals are, you know, social groups themselves, then how do you delineate between individual population?
It's just a mental model, right? Yeah. Like maybe there's one mental model where there is no distinction at all. And then there's a mental model where like each individual has their own individual existence, right? But those are just, this lens would say it's just a model. All right, I'm gonna eat a bagel because I gotta run in a minute. But thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it. And are there any Econ Club announcements or anything like that?
Friday, 5:30.